wasn't necessarily to start with international students. It was to examine independent international mobility of highly skilled women, which is quite often an understudied and invisible group. But as the case is for research and as the process moves forward, highly skilled got narrowed down to international students and gender expanded to include women and men. And Canada was an interesting case because, as this particular graph shows, the increase of international students. International students in Canada, especially in the tertiary level education, make up the second largest group of temporary migrants in Canada after temporary foreign workers, which the gentleman spoke earlier as in the first presentation. Was also interesting is the purpose or the desire for the Canadian government and other government agencies to attract and retain this particular group of students, particular group of migrants in increasing numbers, as the graph shows. And the reason for that, one of them being to cover our demographic and labour market gap that exists within the Canadian society and Canadian labour market. The side benefit of that is an increased revenue to universities and colleges in Canada, because students pay anywhere from something 3 times as much to, if you compare the proportion of students, the fees that international students pay in Quebec versus what domestic or home students pay in Quebec, is almost about 7 times the difference. So there is quite a margin of revenue that's generated. And lastly, or at least in my opinion, it also allows governments to, in a way, circumvent some of the issues of de-skilling and issues around recognition of foreign credentials that newcomers experience when they come into Canada. Because the idea is that the students are, if they already have the Canadian credentials, as is the case, it will allow them to say, you know, there wouldn't be as much of an issue of credentials not being recognized. They would be more experienced about the Canadian society because they've been living here anywhere from 1 to 2 years to 4, 5, 6 years, depending on what level of education they're coming in from. Anywhere from undergraduate to postgraduate, doctoral level, or postgraduate in some cases, but that's a different issue. And so what I found really interesting to examine in terms of my theoretical framework was this holistic framework of gender geography of power, which is by Nassar and Mahler, because it allowed me to be flexible and examine the various levels of analysis, examine the various scales of analysis, as well as include the issue of spatiality and temporality, which is not quite often examined in as much detail with migration research in general, but in international students particularly. And it allowed me to bring gender into the focus, which has not been examined at all in international students and international students in studies in general. A very, very, very quick run through as to what this particular framework means. It speaks to the idea of social and geographic scale, so it goes anywhere from the individual to the family to national, transnational context, and allows us to examine them as these various scales impact each other and they interact with each other. Which also brings the idea of social location and gender being the key one in my research, but also bring the ideas of class, religion, sexuality, and all the other various categorizations that I can probably not think of and someone else would think of a lot more. But to bring all of those things into dialogue with each other and examine the relationships of power that exist, especially when we talk about power geometry and time-space compression, and not just the power relations as they impact one particular scale versus the other, but also the individuals and their experiences of not just being the relationships of powers and structures in the particular country that they're in, but also transnationally. So, for example, in the case of my research, what was the influence of parents in India? How would they shape the experience of students living in Toronto? How would that impact their everyday lifestyle, everyday decision-making, everyday lived experiences, in manner of speaking? And lastly, the role of imagination. It's not necessarily quite often spoken of, but it's very important in the case of international students, because they draw on this idea that's built for them, an imagination of what their life will be like in Canada or anywhere else that they go to work. And Geraldine also spoke to that earlier today. So all of these elements will be combined together, and I was able to sort of move forward, drawing on a particular, more fluid and complex nature of gender, drawing on Judith Butler's work. But I won't go into that as well, because that's not the place for that. Thank you. And the research methods, I drew both on mixed methods, drew on mixed methods of ethnographic research that I did in Canada, lots of in-depth interviews, about 22 in Canada with both men and women. My in-depth interviews and ethnographic research in New Delhi in Toronto over 4 months in the summer, which I do not recommend, because that was interesting, and an online survey that I ran for about a whole year, and we completed about 157 students. Amongst the various findings, which were quite few and across because I did so much different things, the one I want to focus on in the next 2-3 minutes that I have is this idea of settling into Toronto, the experiences of international students in Toronto and Ontario. And no, I won't go over all of those, but I will focus on one particular one, which is the interaction with the diaspora community. Because this was not something that I thought I would come up with in my findings, but it was also very interesting because the words that international students used to describe their engagement or their impression of the South Asian and particularly the Indian community in Toronto was backwards and conservative. As someone who's doing research, I found the term backwards problematic, but those were their words and not mine. But it goes to speak to a body of research literature that exists that says that diaspora communities tend to hold on to this particular idealized notion of what culture is and what they, and what that means, and even though that may not be relevant at this particular time. And I'll use the case of Shabnam, who was an Indian Muslim who was studying at that point an undergraduate degree with one of the university colleges in Toronto. And I'll read her quote, and because I think that'll go to speak to quite a bit, which is, I feel people in the city that she was in India are more balanced. My parents, they're very religious. They pray, they fast regularly, but they also party. They have an amazing social life. They go clubbing, but they don't drink. This also speaks to a particular class of the Indian Muslims and what part they come from in India, and it's something that's not quite often explored. So I tried to adopt that culture here, because that's how I've been brought up, in that environment. I also tried to hold on to my religious beliefs very strongly in my culture. I would put pictures on Facebook of my clubbing and parties in skirts and dresses, and that would give people here in Toronto a shock. The people here said that I was a hypocrite and now I had two sides. I was going out a lot and I was drinking a lot for a while, but then I stopped drinking, and then I also stopped clubbing because everyone kept saying that. What was really interesting, and again, something that I had not expected, was Shabnam spoke about what she felt was she was being discriminated and marginalized by two different communities in Toronto, part of the South Asian community. The first being the Indian community, because she was Muslim and not part of one of the dominant religious groups of Sikhs or Hindus, and the other community being the Pakistani community because she was an Indian Muslim. So for the Indian group, her Muslim identity, her religion identity came first, for the Pakistani group, her national identity of being an Indian came first, and therefore trying to negotiate it. And in order to, in fact, fit in better with this community and to negotiate all these issues that she was facing, she felt she didn't really have anyone to go to and speak to except the religious leaders. And so she started going to mosques more often. To the point where her parents, when they found out, were extremely shocked that all of a sudden their daughter and someone with a particular class background and family's religious views was becoming a stronger practicing Muslim. Because they were in Toronto, not something that they had expected, not something that anyone had expected. On the other hand, we have the case of the story of Tarun and Amina. Tarun was the student I was interviewing, and his, at that point, fiancée Amina, which brought up the issues of tensions of Hindu and Muslim tensions that are in India, this particular conflict, and how those actually brought into and came across into their everyday life in Toronto. Because Amina's parents, who didn't support this particular relationship, were not aware that she was living with her fiancé because they didn't support the relationship, as well as that she was in fact in Toronto. They thought she was working as a highly skilled engineer in the US. She felt if she had told her parents that may not have come across really well. And it's something that they had to negotiate on everyday sort of basis. And in Canada, she was here on her own on a highly skilled temporary foreign worker visa. So on one hand, we have a particular person who is an international student dealing with issues of religion, such as Shabnam. On the other hand, we have the story of Tarun and Amina, Hindu and Muslim, who was supposed to be trying to negotiate their experiences in Toronto, as well as trying to negotiate the various power relations in India with Amina's parents, trying to live their life here, is not knowing what their status would be because they don't really have any idea what their visa status would be or what their migration status would be in Canada due to the temporariness of their status, or what Goldring and others call the precariousness of their migration.